Good afternoon from the Utopia Studios in Rome. It is an honor and a pleasure to participate in this event organized by the Amerigo Association on the theme of religious freedom, which is even more important after the Afghan crisis. We will listen to a couple of introductions by Andrea Gumina, president of Amerigo Association, and David Medaglia, who's a human rights officer at the US Embassy to Rome. Then we will listen to a presentation of the report by Dan Nadel, senior official at the US Department of State, and then we will have several distinguished and authoritative figures who will give their comments. President Gumina, it's up to you to take the floor and to kick off.
Thank you, Mr. Capezzone. Thank you all. Dear friends, fellow alumni, distinguished guests, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, and thank you for having joined us. My deep gratitude goes to the Department of State of the USA, to the US Mission in Italy, and to my outstanding Amerigo's fellows that set up this amazing debate. For those of you that meet us for the very first time, Amerigo is a non-profit organization that gathers Italian alumni that had the opportunity to benefit from the US Department of State Cultural Exchange Program during their lifetime. Let me thank in particular Imam Yahya Pallavicini and Vice President Silvia Minardi for their contribution, and all the panelists, both in Italy and abroad, that made today's event possible. I would only like to spend a few words before leaving the floor to David Medaglia of the US Embassy in Rome and to Dan Nadel, author and coordinator of the 23rd DOS report on international religious freedom. When I virtually attended Secretary of State Antony Blinken's introduction of this report, two considerations hit me most. The first one is that religious freedom at international level is more than a fundamental human right. It affects not only the way anyone remains free to believe or not, but also the posture of people in everyday life, and in particular their need to defend and prevent threats from the state they live in, with all the connected consequences at personal, social, and economic level. The second one is that the attitude that each government exerts in defining or repressing this fundamental right does have consequences in identifying the level and the extent of reliable partnership we could put in place or not. Sad to say, in such difficult times, even within the G20 community, this debate is wide open. Continues to stand along with everyone who defend and promote the four freedoms that inspired President Roosevelt's speech on January 6, 1941. Freedom of speech, of worship, from want and from fear. I hope that debate that will follow will shed additional light on such a crucial topic for the mankind. So thank you all and arrivederci.
President Gumina, and now it's up to you, Mr. Medaglia, to let us listen to your remark.
Anzitutto un onore e un piacere essere qui con voi. Voi parlate in inglese, quindi io posso fare almeno un po' di italiano. Good afternoon. My name is David Medaglia, and I am the Human Rights Officer here at US Embassy Rome. Firstly, on behalf of the entire embassy community, I'm honored to give a virtual welcome to Dan Nadel, the Director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, and to all of the outstanding panelists at this event. Secondly, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to Amerigo for the invitation to speak to you briefly today as we gather to discuss the 2020 International Religious Freedom Report about a topic at the very core of what America stands for. As President Biden said, the work of protecting religious freedom for people of all faiths and none is never finished. We at Embassy Rome strive to uphold the President's words. Working with a wide range of partners, we are committed to protecting and uplifting voices of those of all faiths. For our front office and our chargé d'affaires, Tom Smitham, religious freedom is a fundamental value. To that end, we organize interfaith roundtable events to bring people together to discuss and mitigate potential areas of tension. We meet with faith leaders to find out how their communities feel aggrieved and any potential remedies. We work with Italian politicians and ministries to raise awareness of issues pertaining to religious freedom. And we engage NGOs in an effort to keep our ears tuned to the ground, to understand what is happening, all in furtherance of promoting the fundamental right to be free to worship without fear. The International Religious Freedom Report is the culmination of a considerable effort taken on by embassies and consulates all over the world. It's all in an effort to use America's unique voice to raise the profile of situations that may otherwise go uncovered. In Italy, that effort has entailed highlighting a rise in anti-Semitism, shedding light on the difficulties the Muslim community faces in obtaining permits to build new mosques and cemeteries, and raising the issue of migrant integration, which is often tied to differences in religion. Our work is greatly assisted by our relationships with organizations like Amerigo, who strive to create positive change. U.S. Embassy Rome and Amerigo have a long and fruitful relationship, and the embassy is appreciative of all that Amerigo does to promote American values and to strengthen bilateral ties between our two countries. Through conferences, seminars, and events like that which we are engaged in today, Amerigo plays an invaluable role in amplifying both the ideas and the ideals that form the backbone of the transatlantic partnership, not the least of which is religious freedom. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Medaglia. And now it's up to Dan Nadel, who's senior official at the IRF office at the U.S. Department of State, to make his presentation of the report. Can you hear us, Mr. Nadel? It's up to you.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon to our friends in Italy, and greetings to all those who are tuning in from elsewhere around the world. Sincere thanks to Andrea Gumina, President of the Amerigo Alumni Association, both for the invitation to speak and for the formation of the Committee for Religious Freedom within Amerigo. I also want to thank David, our colleague at the U.S. Embassy in Rome, who is truly the partner of our team, our office, in advancing religious freedom for all, as well as his public diplomacy colleagues who coordinate the programs and exchanges for which we've had the privilege of receiving Italian participants over the years. To those exchange participants viewing today, thank you so much for enriching our society and yours with your ideas, your energy, and your experience. I would like to also salute the esteemed panelists and discussants joining today, beginning with our good friend, Imam Yahya Pallavicini, whose vision and persistence made the Amerigo Committee for Religious Freedom and this event possible. Imam Yahya works closely with my office on multiple global dialogue and peace-building programs, including the Abrahamic Faiths Initiative, of which he is a founding participant. His insight is always invaluable. Another founding participant of the Abrahamic Faiths Initiative here with us is Rabbi David Rosen of the American Jewish community, who has also been a longstanding leader in building bridges across faith groups, breaking ground that paves the way for peace. And sincere greetings as well to Yahya, another founder of the Abrahamic Faiths Initiative, close friend of our office, and the driving voice behind the concept of humanitarian Islam. Professor Cole Durham is also a longtime friend and colleague to our team, and I'm delighted to be here with him and the rest of our distinguished speakers as well. Before I turn to the report, I'd like to mention why today's event and others like it, driven by civil society, are pivotal to improving the freedom of religion or belief landscape and the lot of those suffering religious persecution and abuses globally. The world today is confronted by a series of cascading crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, economic migration, financial instability, and ongoing regional conflicts and the refugee flows they provoke. It would be easy in this challenging environment for the victims and survivors of religiously motivated persecution, who, on account of past discrimination and marginalization, are often highly vulnerable to the foregoing threats. It would be easy for those people to be forgotten or treated as an afterthought as we grapple with these crises. But you today, through this event, we through our report, and through the initiatives of so many others, aim to give voice and a platform to those who cannot and must not be forgotten. With the release of the State Department's 23rd Report on International Religious Freedom this past May, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken underscored our unyielding commitment to promote respect for and defend the freedom of religion or belief for all, everywhere in the world. Over the course of more than 2 decades, we are proud to say that these reports have become an indispensable resource to governments, legislatures, activists, academics, civil society organizations, and religious communities the world over who value and seek to ensure respect for this human right. Our guiding principle in preparing the report is to present all relevant information as objectively, thoroughly, and fairly as possible. And though couched in dry and at times bureaucratic-sounding language, what you see as you delve into the country chapters is a rich fabric of individual stories. These are stories that help us understand the experiences of individuals, communities, and sometimes entire societies. The reports include the personal costs, horrifying stories of discrimination, abuse, torture, disappearance, even death, of someone's parent, their sibling, their son or daughter, for simply trying to organize their lives in accordance with their most basic values and beliefs. You also see stories of those fighting back, those challenging repressive regimes, countering extremist violence, and building coalitions across religious and ethnic divides to combat discrimination, demand rights, and promote shared values of human dignity, mutual respect, and peace. So what do we do with this trove of information? For the United States government and for our Office of International Religious Freedom, we use it as a starting point for advocacy efforts that span the entire year and beyond. We use it as a baseline to understand whether and how things are getting better or worse in a place, to assess whether past engagement has proven effective or should be recalibrated, and to ask whether the case of a particular individual or community has been resolved or requires further attention. Now some ask, doesn't this take a lot of time and resources? What is the United States actually getting for this investment? Well, first, the moral imperative is clear. We as a nation benefit immeasurably from the protections granted by our First Amendment, and it is only natural to want others to share in the wealth of that experience. Our efforts to advance international religious freedom are also firmly rooted in this knowledge. Countries that effectively safeguard this and other human rights are more peaceful, more stable, more prosperous, and more reliable partners of the United States than those that do not. Nations can never achieve their fullest potential when some are excluded from education, healthcare, jobs, or other essentials on account of their innermost beliefs or how they choose to manifest those beliefs. So it has long been recognized that promoting religious freedom is vital to protecting America's national security. And I firmly believe that is true of other governments as well. Another key goal of this report is marked by our desire for governments to review our findings and assess themselves and their practices, hopefully for the better. Perhaps there is a freedom of religion or belief situation or two in any given country that has been neglected by other domestic concerns, or even an outdated law or registration requirement that could be quickly dispensed with, but which has fallen prey to bureaucratic inertia or lack of awareness. We also, through this report, wish to highlight areas or opportunities where local and international civil society might wish to engage. We, of course, as the government, are only one of many actors who can influence the state of religious freedom for all. The report, too, functions as a benchmark from which the relevant agencies in our government and like-minded governments can chart out joint policies, working collectively to address shared concerns on behalf of all. Let me touch briefly on a few key themes that emerged from this year's report. First, efforts to criminalize religious expression are an ineffective and in fact counterproductive tool to promote religious harmony or combat intolerance. While blasphemy laws are particularly pernicious, we are also concerned about laws that aim to regulate a person's ability to wear or not wear religious attire or symbols, or laws that criminalize proselytization or limit parents' ability to provide religious education for their children. Second, excessive and onerous government regulation of religion and religious life alienates citizens from their government and increases the likelihood of individuals resorting to violence to defend their beliefs. Authorities in many countries continue to constrain religious expression through registration laws, or restrictions on religious materials. We now increasingly see governments using the same tactic on the internet, where officials in many countries monitor and heavily censor religious expression online and arrest and harass those involved in online discourse on religion. We strongly encourage governments to engage religious communities and faith leaders as partners and consult with these communities when contemplating changes to laws or policies that may impact religion or belief. Third, no society, including our own, is immune from the scourge of religious discrimination, whether manifesting as anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, xenophobia, or marginalization of Christians, atheists, or any others. Education and youth-focused programs are vital to promote an understanding of the value and importance of pluralism and mutual respect for all. We remain committed to working with government and civil society partners to tackle problems like hate crimes, discrimination, and religiously motivated violence in ways that do not interfere with freedom of religion or belief or freedom of expression. And finally, we must all remain vigilant for early warnings of possible mass atrocities targeting religious minorities around the globe. In a few short years, we have seen genocide perpetrated by ISIS against Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims in areas under its control. We have seen atrocities, including ethnic cleansing, committed by the Burmese military against Rohingya. It is certainly no coincidence that those behind the recent military coup in Burma are many of the same people who have led the repression of members of that country's ethnic and religious minority groups for decades. And today, we cannot look away from the ongoing crimes against humanity and genocide the People's Republic of China is perpetrating against Uyghur Muslims and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. These crimes were preceded by decades of repression of members of religious and belief groups, including Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, and practitioners of Falun Gong. We persist in this work because of the unfortunate truth that many of the challenges to religious freedom we see in the world today are structural, systemic, and deeply entrenched. But we must not give up. These challenges demand sustained commitment from all of us who are unwilling to accept hatred, intolerance, and persecution as the status quo. The United States is committed to using all available tools, both positive and punitive, to advance universal respect for human rights for all. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation to come.
Thank you, Mr. Nadel, for this presentation, and now we will listen to several comments and remarks on this presentation. The first one is by Rabbi David Rosen, who's director of the American Jewish Committee for Interreligious Affairs. Rabbi Rosen, it's up to you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well. I am very grateful for this invitation to be part of this very important discussion. I express my gratitude to the organizers, particularly to Imam Yahya Pallavicini, who really is a source of great inspiration in the whole area of interreligious engagement and promoting a diverse, respectful world of appreciation of the heritage of our different communities. And of course, I take this opportunity, even though I work for an American organization, to express my gratitude to the State Department for its continuous work of enormous importance in heightening the challenges and the problems that are faced by communities all around the world in the pursuit of what is a fundamental human right, and of course needs to be seen by that. This might sound obvious, but it is not. There are those in our world, in our freer world, who see religion as an obstruction to other freedoms, and it's really important that government's leadership within secular forces as well as religious forces highlight the significance of this freedom as not one that is inimical to others, but on the contrary, benefits others enormously in so many different ways. And so much research has been done showing how where there is religious freedom, societies are more civil in both senses and are more productive in so many different ways. So the importance of religious freedom needs to be held up as a value that is not only, as already Mr. Nadel mentioned, a moral value in and of itself, but has very important pragmatic consequences for open societies, for healthy societies, for productive societies. Allow me also just to add that the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, has close collaboration with the State Department in these areas in so many different ways, but not least of all through our Jacob Blaustein Institute, that is headed by a former Religious Freedom Commissioner, Felice Guerre, and that has just produced a very disturbing survey of the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the world, following on very much from the important UN report that Dr. Ahmed Shaheen presented in 2019. Of course, this subject becomes even more acute, as has also been mentioned, in the shadow of the pandemic, COVID-19. COVID-19, as the report shows, has been used very often as an excuse by authoritarian and undemocratic regimes and by various restrictive forces to justify a clampdown on freedoms, often to an even greater extent where they were already in peril. What we have seen particularly, and the report on anti-Semitism is an example of it, is the abuse of technology. This obviously is something that is here to stay. There are ways in which we can control the abuse of such so-called social media. I say so-called because very often the use is very anti-social. But nevertheless, this is going to remain a challenge, and a challenge that we have to look at in so many different ways, and that relates to a broader context, which I will mention in a moment. These tools of modern technology, of modern digital communications, have allowed ideas and attitudes that once upon a time were very, very marginal to become almost mainstream and access people across sections, and in particular, vulnerable youth who are open to misinformation, disinformation, but of course not only youth. Conspiracy theories have multiplied during this particular period, targeting specific groups, specific religious groups in particular. And of course, I'm particularly aware of the way anti-Semitism has been resurgent in these tools to claim that pandemics are promoted by Jews, by Jewish interests of various kinds, and to be able to use this tragic situation to advocate or to employ bigotry and prejudice on a scale that we had not previously seen. And this becomes a challenge in relation to all communities that are targeted in this particular way. While restrictions can obviously be demanded of by the social media platforms in various ways, and probably there needs to be a more systematic approach towards collaboration and greater control and responsibility in these regards, there is another dimension that we have to consider in all of this, which I think is an enormous area and a very big challenge for us all. And this is the fact that restrictions on religious freedom and persecution of religious minorities is facilitated by lack of information and by lack of knowledge. Sometimes, of course, it's motivated by specific political interests and is just a tool for brutal repression of any kind of freedom of expression. But at the same time, a great deal of misinformation, disinformation, and of perverse theories are circulated on the basis of great deal of ignorance. And the need for us to engage in multi-religious education and to consider religious literacy as a basic educational necessity becomes all the more imperative. I realize this is difficult because in many societies, there is a fear that this may lead to some form of religious partisanship and undermine a broader secular character. But I'm afraid that cannot be justification for allowing this whole area to be vacated and to create a vacuum that negative forces are able to exploit. And I'm not just talking about within the countries concerned. I'm actually, in a sense, talking more about those of us who are privileged to live in the free world, who care about the principle of human rights. I think have to appreciate that in areas where religion is abused, whether because of its own distorted perception or as a tool by authoritarian regimes, those of us and those governments, our governments, and the staff of those governments, of our governments, who are engaged in this issue, need themselves to be religiously literate. I'm not saying that they have to be religious practitioners, but to be able to engage in these issues when you don't know the basics and the fundamentals, teachings, concerns, trepidations, sensitivities with regards to those different communities makes it very, very difficult. Of course, we have to put enormous emphasis and must continue with the advocacy that comes in terms of direct state communications, political, diplomatic pressures of various kinds, when needs be, to be able, if these can be effective, to utilize the tool of sanctions. But these need to be utilized by those who have a knowledge of the way those societies approach this whole particular dimension, so that the language of engagement can be a language of communication rather than simply of adversariality. And this is, of course, all the more so when we come to those societies themselves. And this is not a simple thing. How do you get interreligious sensitivity and religious literacy into societies themselves that are dominated usually by one particular culture and historical identity, and very often can be fearful of the opportunity for other identities to be able to flourish within their own particular societies? Well, in a sense, I've already alluded to something there that needs to be understood, and that is the question of fears. And when we therefore engaged authoritarian regimes, we have to be alive to what these fears are. That comes back again to the area of our own religious literacy. But it also means the way in which we interact with these particular regimes. One thing that's really important is that many of these regimes are, and those elements within those societies which exploit religion in a destructive way, don't think they're being destructive. Very often they think that they are being loyal to their own particular religious tradition that requires them, in their, we would say, distorted perception, to limit the freedoms of others. This is where both intra-religious as well as inter-religious engagement is so critical. I may be unaware of more use than I think has been made, but there have been certain remarkable statements, not only coming from, let's say, in the case of the abuse in Muslim societies, not only in the case of religious leaders from the Muslim communities in the West, but one example would be Sheikh Abdullah bin Bay's important declaration based on the Charter of Medina that was issued in Morocco in collaboration with Morocco, but of course was an intra-Arab declaration, and there have been other declarations. But this one particularly rooted within a specific heritage, idea, and covenant made by the Prophet Muhammad. And this important declaration emphasizes the value of diversity, of respect for minorities, and of the need to be able to advocate such religious freedom precisely as a good Muslim. These are the kind of texts and declarations that need to be widely disseminated, and every government that cares about religious freedom should be knowledgeable about these declarations, should utilize these declarations constructively. There is also another rub there. Very often, if somebody who is not part of a tradition comes in to be able to speak to a particular community and claim that this tradition is not behaving as it should be, there's understandably a negative reaction. That is why this needs to be done through agencies that can have credibility within those societies, and also the interreligious engagement in which people from those communities that are threatened and people from those communities that share the same culture or faith tradition that is being exploited in an oppressive way are seen to communicate with one another. This is why governments and NGOs need to take full advantage of the enormous development in the field of interreligious relations to ensure that those who are active in this field are partners in the religious advocacy program and in the pursuit of religious freedom. In fact, I would say that one of the things that needs to be done far more extensively is to ensure that interfaith delegations of people made up of those specific different communities, of the majority and the minority, visit those countries where there are challenges, become visible, so that people in that society can see how their own co-religionists relate in a very different way to those other religious groups, to bring people who are leaders in that group, and especially from younger generations, to visit communities where they can see that kind of diversity, and to be able to ensure that one develops a new culture, very often very new to the whole ethos of so many societies where such abuse takes place. Of course, there's no cookie cutter here. We are talking of an enormous world where religion is very diverse. It means different things in different places, and very often the same religion can be of a different order. In some places it is directly connected to the political regime and to civil authority. Other places it is more of, if you like, of a challenge, a creative challenge to those societies. But in all those societies, religion within those societies needs to be engaged both internally as well as to be able to be engaged with those outside, to be able to advocate for a more diverse approach rooted in the teachings of each religious tradition. I don't think you'll find any religious tradition in the world that believes that what they are advocating for in any context is designed in order to deny people their well-being and their happiness. We will all find distorted ways to interpret what is really good for people. But when minds and hearts are opened through the human encounter to the degree that one can facilitate that, and today we also have these kind of tools that we are using now of telecommunications in which ideas and thoughts can be disseminated even more widely. So together with advocacy and with continuously keeping our beady eyes on everything that is taking place and all the distortions, perversions, and misbehavior, which the United States has shown such an important leadership in doing, we have to ensure that we are also proactive in an educational manner that can open up hearts and minds to a different way of viewing diversity within those particular societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosen, for your remarks. And now it's up to Charles Holland Taylor to take the floor. Charles Holland Taylor is emissary for the UN, Americas and Europe of Gerakan Pemuda Answer. He's chairman and CEO of Liberal Foundation and delegate of Cholil Staquf, who's Secretary General of Nahdlatul Ulama from Indonesia. Mr. Charles Holland Taylor, it's up to you to take the floor. You have to switch on your microphone, please.
Thank you.
Extremely kind of you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. I apologize for any disappointment that Kiai Haji Yahya Staquf, the General Secretary of Nahdlatul Ulama, was unable to join us because at the last minute he had an urgent meeting with the chairman of the executive board of Nahdlatul Ulama. And they have just literally in a matter of days, 20,000 ulama joining, 20,000 Muslim religious scholars coming together for a national conference of Nahdlatul Ulama religious scholars preparing for a quinquennial every 5 years National Congress to set their policy for the next 5 years and elect their new leadership. And so he sends his regards to all of you and asks that I fill in on his behalf. I've read in the past years many of the statements of the State Department reports. Of course, every year I read the report on Indonesia. I read other countries' reports. I read prior to this meeting the report on Indonesia, and I certainly did not find anything in the document that was inaccurate. It might be useful to provide some background. As the gentleman who introduced me indicated, I represent the Nahdlatul Ulama Young Adults Movement, age 20 to 40. Obviously, I'm older than that, but I represent them to the United Nations, Europe, and America. So the organization, Gerakan Pemuda Ansor, has 5 million members. The Nahdlatul Ulama has 90 million members. They represent approximately or over 40% of Indonesia's population. They're a decisive force and have been a decisive force in what was once the Dutch East Indies, subsequently became Indonesia, since their founding in 1926. And they are a key force. In Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama is referred to as Soko Negara. It means a pillar which upholds the nation state. And the nation state in question, the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia, is what is known as a Pancasila state. A Pancasila refers to 5 principles upon which the nation state was founded in 1945. And it is a multi-religious and pluralistic nation state. Last year, there was a report, a Religious Freedom Landscape report published by the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington on Indonesia. And Bob Hefner from Boston University, one of the top experts globally on Indonesia, pointed out something very interesting in that report. He indicated that in 1945, the Christian population of Indonesia was approximately 3% of the population at that time. Today, the Christian population is over 10%. And if we were to look around the world, this is not uncommon in Korea or in parts of Africa, but it is certainly uncommon in the Muslim world. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim majority state, the world's largest Muslim majority democracy, the 4th most populous country in the world, and to over triple its Christian population over the past 75 years is a remarkable phenomenon. And I may speak to that for a moment and then speak on a broader sense in how Nahdlatul Ulama and the spiritual leadership of the world's largest Muslim organization views the issue of religious freedom. President Wahid was once asked, I was with him, by news crew. He said, what is your position on, what is Nahdlatul Ulama's position on apostasy laws? And which are, of course, integral part of classical Islamic law, classical Islamic orthodoxy, dating back to the apostasy wars that followed the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the 7th century AD. President Wahid laughed and said, well, if we wanted to enforce apostasy laws in Indonesia, we'd have to cut off 20 million heads. But there's a very specific reason why they have not done so. There's a very specific reason why the Indonesian constitution guarantees or certainly promises religious freedom. Indonesia is not perfect, and I can briefly address that in the limited time we have here. Of course, Indonesia has problems in religious freedom, and the State Department's report has identified a number of those problems and has done so for many years, and laudably so. But I think it's also very important to understand a context, because every country has positives and negatives. Every society has elements which are profoundly humane and civilized, and other elements where human selfishness runs rampant. And I'm sure that most of the people, or certainly many of the people on this in this meeting, may have heard that in 2017, the governor of Jakarta, who was an ethnic Chinese Christian, was severely criticized for some statements that he made, and then there were mass demonstrations, as many as 500,000 people in the streets. He ultimately lost a re-election as the mayor of Jakarta and was sentenced to 2 years in prison for blasphemy. The interesting thing in this regard is that this was primarily a political phenomenon. The organization that I represent actually was defending Ahok, the Chinese, ethnic Chinese governor of Jakarta. But there were very powerful political parties positioning themselves in advance of the 2019 presidential election, and also powerful business interests, including ethnic Chinese Christian business people whose corrupt practices in Jakarta had been blocked by the governor, who allied with, and I just, we speak very directly here, allied with the Muslim Brotherhood political party in Indonesia, allied with certain extremists in Indonesia, and then funding came from the business elites, mobilization came from political parties that had a political interest, and then the certain tenets of classical Islamic orthodoxy and Islamic law, including a verse from Al-Ma'idah, a verse from a chapter in the Quran, do not take non-Muslims, including Christians and Jews, to be your leaders, were cited as grounds for rejecting Ahok as a Christian leader. I think what's important to recognize in this context is that prior to these events, Ahok was a Christian governor of the largest metropolis in the Muslim world. And that is significant, very significant. And he was so popular, he was polling at 70% prior to these problems arising. But opportunistic politicians realized that if they wanted to get to President Jokowi in the 2019 elections, they could try to take out this governor, because Jokowi had been the governor of Jakarta prior to this, and use Islam to do so. Now, we all know that the history of religion has periodically throughout history been used for selfish purposes, for political purposes, and also the history of humanity as such. There's constantly been conflict throughout history. If you look at those elements of Islamic law that deal with the treatment of non-Muslims, that call for the establishment of a caliphate, that reject the modern constitutions and the laws associated with modern political processes, or call for Muslims to join fellow Muslims in conflict with non-Muslims whenever there's a conflict between religions. All of this is rooted within the history of the emergence of Islamic orthodoxy and Islamic law in the Middle East at a time when Muslim populations largely consolidated, and then we're fighting the Byzantines, we're fighting the Persians, and into India, we're fighting in various directions, and it's just a part of history. And I like to say that in the Middle Ages, if someone was Jewish, they didn't judge Christianity by its theology or its theories. It was a question of what Christians they met. And for a Jewish person in Europe to meet someone like St. Francis must have been a beautiful experience. But to meet the Grand Inquisitor would be pretty terrifying. So I think it's very important in the context. This is one thing I would say in terms of the State Department's reports, and also looking how to find a way out, how to actually promote religious freedom in a practical sense. Here in Indonesia, the Nahdlatul Ulama understands exactly who those forces are, what those forces are that oppose religious freedom in Indonesia. I represent an organization and a tradition which reestablished, because the Nahdlatul Ulama is 100 years old, but the ancestors of the people I work with are Indonesian Muslims who have a history of 400 years plus of religious freedom in Indonesia. But they, 400 years ago, reestablished religious liberty in Indonesia when it was threatened by the arrival of a political understanding of Islam in the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, this is something, so it's not an accident. There's a historical background that exists here. And I think that for all of those who are familiar with history, I'm saying that in Java, in Indonesia, the ancestors of the founders, of the leaders of Nahdlatul Ulama, reestablished religious liberty 450 years ago. This is 230 years, 240 years before the Virginia Declaration of Religious Freedom, and before the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So I think it's very valuable. Like Rabbi Rosen was saying, it's critical to have religious literacy. It's critical to be historically literate. And in being historically literate, I think it's important to take note also that the entire, what used to be the Indianized civilizational sphere, prior to certain historical circumstances after 1000 AD, and the arrival of European colonialism, there was a unified Indianized civilizational sphere stretching from Afghanistan, parts of Central Asia, through the heartland of India, Sri Lanka, peninsular and archipelagic Southeast Asia, which was very heavily under the influence of a religious political philosophy, religious sociocultural philosophy, which believed inherently in religious freedom. It's actually one of the world's great treasures. In India, it's embodied in the rock edicts and pillar edicts of Ashoka. The Indian flag has on it the Dharma chakra of Ashoka, and the seal of India is the three lions and the Dharma chakra of a pillar that had Ashoka's edicts. And Ashoka and the Indians sent out you could say a proselytizing, not a geopolitical mission, not a military mission, but a proselytizing mission, which spread an understanding of religious pluralism throughout the region, which still has very, very deep roots here. And if we talk about Nahdlatul Ulama has been defending its traditional understanding of Islam, which is pluralistic, which is tolerant. Actually, I'll quickly read you a poem from the spiritual leader of Nahdlatul Ulama. It's just a few verses, just a few seconds to read, but it will give you an idea of the deep-rooted cultural traditions that exist in Indonesia and how Indonesians have traditionally viewed religion and religious diversity. It's translated, and I translated it into English. It's called Religion. And it reads, "Religion is a golden carriage prepared by God to convey you along the path to his divine presence. Do not become mesmerized by its beauty, much less enchanted to the point that you come to blows with your own brothers and sisters over who occupies the front seat. Depart, he has been waiting for you ever so long." Now, this gentleman is the former chairman of the Nahdlatul Ulama Supreme Council. He is one of the most preeminent, not just religious figures, but artistic figures in Indonesia and philosophical figures. His nephew is currently the Minister of Religious Affairs in Indonesia, and the Minister of Religious Affairs in December, together with the Minister of State Security, Education issued a ruling, and this is in terms of what you were saying, Dan, earlier about freedom to wear or not wear religious attire. There have been various regional Sharia regulations in Indonesia imposing dress codes on women, very often on Muslim women requiring a head covering or certain attire, but also in certain regions on non-Muslim women requiring Muslim type, so-called Muslim attire. Mustafa Bisri, whose poem I just read, his nephew, who was the former chairman of Gerakan Pemuda Ansor, the organization I represent, and who is now the Minister of Religious Affairs, they issued a national decree instructing all state schools, and there's over 250,000 state schools in Indonesia, instructing every state school to allow every person attending those schools to choose to wear or not wear religious attire as they see fit individually, including teachers. Now, this is a huge development, huge, and it shows the power of vision, the power of culture, the power of confidence, because this gentleman I mentioned, the Minister of Religious Affairs, Yahya Cholil, Yakut Cholil Kumas, his organization, Nahdlatul Ulama, every Christmas and every Easter sends tens, if not hundreds of thousands of their militia members to defend Christian churches from attack. They even have had people killed from their organization, removing a bomb, a man who removed a bomb from a Christian church in East Java on Christmas Eve about 15 years ago, whom they regard as a martyr. So the organization is very much focused on trying to preserve religious freedom in Indonesia, but religious freedom, freedom of opinion, as well as religious freedom. I also take my hat off to you, David, for mentioning the importance of recognizing that threats can come from any number of directions. As you also said, Dan, in China, you have the Chinese Communist Party threatening religious freedom. In Muslim majority societies, that threat usually comes from fundamentalist Muslims who are seeking to impose elements of classical Islamic law on society, but it's innate in human nature to be dogmatic, and it's innate in human nature to tend to be supremacist and to trend in an identitarian direction. And I think that's why not only Article 18, but also Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that it is a universal human right to have freedom of opinion and freedom of expression. Human beings throughout history have always felt that it was convenient, if they had power, to block other human beings from expressing their opinions freely. The post-World War II order, in which ideas that appeared in the United States with the Bill of Rights became embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is an anomaly in human history. So from an Indonesian perspective and the perspective of the spiritual leaders of Nahdlatul Ulama, one of the most important tasks in front of all of us and in front of humanity is thinking very, very deeply and acting wisely in order to preserve and strengthen a post-World War II order which protects national sovereignty, which has enshrined the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which offers the hope and the promise that human beings, as we move into a global civilization in the 21st century, where people of different faiths, different ethnicities are living in such close proximity, that we will find a way on the basis of shared values, both people who belong to certain religious faiths and those who do not have a particular religious faith, but on the basis of shared values can respect differences, including differences of opinion. And we feel that this is of the utmost importance. We're very happy that the United States is pursuing a religious liberty agenda. We also would hope that the United States would realize that in today's world, as we know, you look historically with the rise of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and secularism in the West, dogma and oppression does not always come only from the direction of religion. It comes from human beings. Human beings can pervert the noble teachings and purposes of religion for dogmatic purposes or political purposes, but so can people who have a secular worldview. So we think that it's of the utmost importance that the United States, that our friends in Europe realize that we have a precious heritage and form relationships with people of goodwill of every faith and nation to protect this precious heritage, to protect not just freedom of religion, but freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression. And I thank you for this opportunity to be with you.
Thank you once again for your remarks. And now we are getting into the second part of this event. We will have a conversation among the members of the Amerigo Committee for Religious Freedom, Professor David McNaghy, Dr. Stefano Gobbi, and Imam Yahya Pallavicini. Professor McNaghy, it's up to you.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that the real problem is to have a distinction between prejudice and stereotype that we can confront with education and the political use of stereotypes. So in a society with a big crisis, like it happened in France in the period of Dreyfus affair, or like it is happening today in many Arabic countries, in Islamic countries, with the demonization of Israel and the Jewish culture, and what it is happening with the complotic mentality in the West, and not just in the West, in all the world. So the very danger is not coming from the prejudice that we can confront with education in a situation of peace, but with the crisis of the society and the political use as a bomb of all the prejudice inside religions. Because every religion has problems with itself. Every tradition has to confront with itself and to make an analysis of its history. But not all the religions are able today to confront themselves in the same time, in the same way. if we see the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, it is more easy, because after Nostra Aetate, it was a great development of dialogue, and the Christianity was able to read in a different way the prejudice inside the gospel, inside the teaching of the father of the church, or the fathers of the church. The question between Islam and Judaism is more complex. It is more complex, but I am a positive in the perspective. The reason, because I see the accord of Abraham and the Gulf between Israel and some countries in the Gulf, it is very positive, because it is the first time in the Middle East, but not just in the Middle East, in all the Arabic countries, in which, in a statement, an Islamic country recognized the Jews not just a dhimmi, not just a community a protected community by the law of Omar, but as a nation, as a free people. And so it is a very important fact. And we have to support this process. We understand that the process is connected with geopolitical problem. There are many contradictions. I know it is not coming from the paradise. It is coming from the conflicts also. There is a big conflict in the Middle East, in all the area. But we have to see the positive aspects. If we see the peace between Egypt and Israel, why something it was not enough in that peace? Because religion was not present in the peace relationship. And so for many times, the peace between Israel and Egypt was a freezy, was not a peace. Because inside Egypt, the rise of anti-Semitism was present, and the peace was not able to develop itself in a dialogue, in a real dialogue. Also, the other process of relationship between Israel and other states and other Arabic states were not like this first process. And we have to see the positive aspect. I think that in the future could be developed also with the Shiite tradition. We have to be positive and to support all the aspects that can open a door for the future. The door is closed today, and we have to open it. But we can open it if we are aware of the danger, of the problems. We cannot close our eyes. We have to see really the problems, and to see and to find the pragmatic aspects that could help the change also inside theology. Not to change the religions, but to change the interpretations and the relationship between leadership, between different traditions, and create something that in the past was a dream. We have to help the dream of the past. We are connected with the dreams of the past. In every traditions, it was a dream of peace, and we have to help it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor McNaghy, for your extremely sincere presentation of the problems that are on the carpet. We cannot be blind to the extreme complexity we have to face. Dr. Gopi, it's up to you.
Thank you so much. When we lose the right to be different, we lose the privilege to be free, said US lawyer and politician Charles Ivan Hughes. Article 3 of the Italian Constitution says all citizens have equal social dignity and are equal before the law, without distinction of sex, race, language, religion, political opinion, and personal and social conditions. Equality lives in diversity. We need to identify values that allow us to live together. Indeed, to live together despite and thanks to our differences through dialogue. Sport, I want to explain this about sport. Sport is undoubtedly one of the best tools, vehicles to promote dialogue. Patrick Kelly, Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Seattle University, underlined how the Catholic Church is taking a significant step in the direction of the world, to be present where people are. In 2018, a very important document on sports of Catholic Church was released, Giving Your Best. The document deals closely with what happens to the human person in the context of sports and questions, what leads to his integral development, the pursuit of the common good and the unity of the human family, not the religious or national family, the human family. One of the striking features of the document is the part on play and sport as the dimension of the church's cultural and theological heritage. San Tommaso d'Aquino, in his Summa Theologica, 12th century about, supports the need for play and recreation in fully human life. This ethics of play influenced late medieval preaching on games and sports, and led humanists and early Jesuits to provide time for play and sports during the school day, and later Catholics to do the same around the world. Pope Francis, he loves lots of the sports, says the need for the other includes not only teammates, but also managers, coaches, fans, the family, in short, of those people who, with commitment and dedication, allow you to give your best. Another of the positive dimensions of sports in the age of internet is that it offers young people the opportunity to meet face-to-face while engaging in activity that arouses passions. In this context, they must learn to exercise self-control and manage conflicts within the team. However, the document underlines the solidarity in the Christian sense must go beyond the members of one's own teams. Competition can be a context in which people have encounters with others who are very different from themselves and can even help them glimpse the unity of the human family. Pope Francis says again, this is possible because the language of sport is universal. It extends beyond borders, language, race, religions, and ideology, possesses the ability to unite people, fostering dialogue and acceptance. The document also says that since the main good of sport in the human being, all those who wish to participate should be able to do so, in particular, poor or displaced people, children mostly, physically or intellectually disabled people, homeless people, and refugees. The Olympic and Paralympics Games are already tools for dialogue today, allowing widespread participation that overcomes all barriers. In every Olympic or Paralympic, represented all athletes of completely different cultures and religion coexist, united under their national flag. Furthermore, since 2016, an Olympic team for refugees has participated in these events. The World Cup for homeless is another sign of hope regarding the creation of a culture of inclusion in sport. Another view of the link between religion and sport is highlighted by Arthur Remillard, professor of religious studies of St. Francis University. He tells us, in America, the history of religion and sports begins with bodies in motion and continues while these bodies are inscribed with a sacred meaning, each sign bearing the traces of the most cherished value of a given population. Sport has also become part of the American religious civil common sense as an athletic expression of national identity. In Italy, the growth of Oriental sports disciplines and outdoor sports has been very important to consolidate the sports movement made up of 97 national organizations, over 100,000 amateur sport associations, over 20 million practitioners, and 77,000 sport facilities, especially during pandemic. In recent years, the paths, the Roman roads, or those of pilgrims across Europe have become one of the main tools for meetings, dialogue, and intercultural and interreligious relationships, which allow us to get to know rural areas and communities, and often not touristy, and to live a unique experience of physical and mental well-being. Are there sports models and venues that fully have the capacity to help dialogue? In Italy, there is a unique place for socializing, the oratorio. Throughout the country, we have a prevalence of presence in the north. There are about 8,000 oratori, 8,000 oratori. The Catholic religion dimensions the cornerstone of the oratorio activity, but is not discriminating element. 1 in 10 children who attend the oratorio is foreigner, and 1 in 3 is Muslim. Oratorio means sport for everyone, even for those who cannot afford it, but also after-school activities, training courses, parties, events, summer camps, campsites, a multicultural community that develops with different activities, grows with children, and involves their families. Many international famous athletes were also born in the oratorio. Pope Francis says, when I see what certain athletes are capable of, especially those who have some disabilities imprinted on their bodies, I'm amazed by the power of life. Behind the sportsman, amateur or professional, there is always an educator, a coach. It is thanks to the commitment, patience, and testimony of those people that sports will have a greater or lesser capacity to make a society growth more inclusive, cohesive, integrated in diversity. Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, president of the Pontifical Council for Culture and promoter of the Vatican Athletics, the first sport association in the Vatican City State, said, perhaps the link between culture and sport is still surprising. And if in the past there were 2 contexts that were opposed, those who did well in their studies normally had a very low grade in gymnastics, it is increasingly understood, as was already the case in the classical world, that sports and culture are deeply intertwined with each other. Sport is a universal language like true Esperanto. Sport is clearly an element that accompanies the entire development of our civilization, and today, more than ever, it has become a central element in the life of people and communities. The future of our civilization is not based on political or economic foundation. It entirely depends on the direction given to the education, said Pierre de Coubertin, founder of International Olympic Committee. It is our biggest investment in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Gobi, for this particular perspective. And now it's up to Imam Yahya Pallavicini to take the floor. Can you hear us?
Yes, I hope you hear me as well. Thank you very much, and thanks to all the speakers. Let me just, before mentioning my 3 points as a proposal for an implementation in the European policies, give also the reason why a European citizen and a Muslim theologian looks to the international report of the Department of State of the United States as a very interesting and important occasion. Because of course it gives us also the occasion to make a comparative analysis, but it's also an example of how, according to my vision, a secular institution is seriously engaging on analysis on religious freedom as a fundamental right and linking this in international relations and policies. And I see this as a very important occasion also for European citizens, as I try to do in the Committee of Amerigo for Religious Freedom. The other point would be also that the 2 key words, as Dan Nadel has mentioned, respect and defend, need to be underlined and understood in a very serious way. Because I think if we have a vision of society and have a vision of life coming from any cultural or religious or spiritual dimension, and want to implement the defense of sacredness of universal values of life and the respect, as it was mentioned just now by Stefano Gobbi, of diversity, then we are actually partners in a implementation and in a common work for this vision of society. The 3 words I want to try to present is actually identity, the second would be discrimination, and the third is the practice. Identity has been mentioned very wisely in the experience of Rabbi David Rosen from Jerusalem. It's a question of changing the perception of reality from what is marginal to what is mainstream, which is very difficult to manage. And on the other side, it's not only, as it was mentioned, a lack of information or knowledge, but it's rather misinformation and disinformation. So these are the challenges in terms of identity religious citizens, believers, and leaders need to face. And as a consequence, we see the abuse of religion or the justification of any violent act thanks to the mention of a religious identity or in the name of God. And there is an instrumentalization of doctrine or dogmatic extremist interpretations as a challenge for believers, especially for members of the same community and for all citizens and all institutional governments worldwide. And the idea is that in order to preserve and work for this clear and true and authentic identity, we probably need to, as it is probably part of the process within the Abrahamic Faith Initiative, inspired by the Department of State, the U.S. Department of State, is to train a new generation of scholars, of religious reliable advisors that can link between their true knowledge of their identity, but with 2 extra skills. The first one is the science of interpretation, and the second one is the contextualization. Otherwise, we're only copying and pasting doctrine without any intellectual or spiritual understanding and trying to implement this as a formalistic bigotry in our societies. So we need a new generation of reliable religious leaders that can make this link, as the State Department is doing, between international policies and freedom of religion. And this empowerment of a task force that can follow several issues in different regions of the world can actually try to help what, again, David Rosen was mentioning in terms of visibility of a interreligious committee that can try to show how the harmony of interreligious relations can help coexistence, but also values and rights. The second keyword would be discrimination, or rather hatred or persecution. Again, we need to find probably some new guidelines, because at least we have two different ways of considering discrimination, hatred, and persecution. On one side, you have probably populism, or on the other side, you have a totalitarian regime. So there is a great difference between this discrimination in the East as well as in the West. And the consequence of these two narrow-minded extremist interpretations in politics is double standards for citizens and believers. So you have, if I may say, a ultra-secular extremism and an ultra-monoconfessional extremism. And again, I think that the solution could be in an interconfessional, interreligious task force that can link the differences, unity and diversity among religions, among minorities and majority religions, but also in the context of a secular postmodern society. And the last point would be practice, because as it was mentioned, and again, Professor David Meghnagi mentioned this very briefly, it is how to put into practice our intention and sensitivity for dialogue and knowledge. So we have to find solutions on who, and my proposal is a training of a new generation of interconnected interreligious leaders, and how, as I mentioned, is the respect of the context within the interpretation of doctrine according to the social and cultural identity, where that's quite an interesting question. My idea is at least no ghettos, no marginalization, no alienation. We have to find ways to allow citizens to be full citizens also within their own religious beliefs. And the last point would be practice, because at the end, it's a question of prayers, preaching, rituals, symbols, education, again, as it was mentioned. And so, the solution, practical solution of these rituals and symbols with every religious community in a secular context, as it can be in Europe, needs to be discussed with patience and with a clear vision of the context. And it's through dialogue and knowledge between religious trained leaders and consistent secular institutions that some practical solution can find their way and avoid any discrimination. But these are my proposals, and I think we'll be happy to probably study these even in the coming G20 Interfaith Forum, for which we'll be looking forward to Professor Melloni's advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imam Yahya Pallavicini. So, thanks to this conference from the beginning till now, there has been a huge increase of our understanding and awareness of the problems. So, now we will listen to two final remarks by Silvia Minardi, who is Vice President of Amerigo Association, and by Professor Alberto Melloni, Coordinator of G20 Interfaith Forum. Silvia Minardi, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks a lot to all of the speakers and the participants and the people who are following us through the Facebook page of the association. It's not easy to draw the conclusions to such a thought-provoking meeting, but if I can say something, I think that personally I'm bringing with me three strong messages tonight. The first, there is a need to know more about the report and about religious freedom. Religious freedom is not well understood. David Rosen mentioned lack of knowledge, great deal of ignorance behind many of the contradictions that our societies are suffering from as regards this element. The second message, if we relegate religious freedom to the enclosed limits of our churches, synagogues, mosques, we are basically encouraging new forms of discrimination and separation, whereas it's Amerigo's mission to build bridges. And that's why I'm particularly proud as an Amerigo member to be offering this opportunity to know more about the report and about what religious freedom represents from a cultural point of view in the US history. The third message I can bring with me is that religious freedom is not the problem in many different situations of tension around the world, but it can be part of the solution. And it's up to us. It's up to also civil society and an association like ours. I think it's also right to say thank you to all of the people who have made this meeting possible, and in particular my personal thanks to Yahya Pallavicini, who encouraged me a lot to go on with this idea of a committee, and Andrea Gumina, who has never abandoned us in his position as the president of the association. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Silvia Minerdi. And now, Professor Melloni, your final remarks.
Thank you very much to Amerigo and Dr. Gumina for this invitation, and for you and for those the speaker who added so many important remarks to the work that we are doing now in this very last hours for the preparation of the G20 Interfaith Forum to be held in Bologna from September 11 to September the 14th. As a historian, I'm very fond and very careful about the issue of languages. For instance, I've been surprised since a long time by a very dangerous permission that we gave to ourselves to call terrorist and violent extremists radical, and to call wise and holy persons moderate. I think that in spirituality, there is a need of radicalism that is very important, and that is very dangerous to leave the noble word of radical to violent, criminal, and people killing the other. At the same, it is very normal in the common language to speak about religious leaders, even if we don't know very much how much they are leading and who they are leading, and to leave aside an important category of medieval theology and philosophy, that is authority, that is not always present in a leader, and not always people with authorities have an actual leadership, but they have a role. And so when we speak about religious freedom, and even in the acronyms of a FORB, that is very normal, there is, of course, something that is useful, needed, and practical, like to speak about radical terrorists or religious leaders. But we also have to be very careful to the fact that religious freedom, as it was said also today, is not a very easy category to be used. I always remember that in the Constitution of the Soviet Union, that was a wonderful expression and guarantee of religious freedom. And we know that it was not simply hypocritical, but it was made in a way in which other instances are growing. And as Dr. Nadel was saying at the beginning, the problem is not simply to say something about religious freedom, but also to put this into practice. From my point of view, on the eve of this Interfaith Forum that Italy is presiding and that I have the honor and the duty to arrange, one of the most important aspects is concerning the consequences of these waving languages and this weak languages that we use. That is something to do with religious literacy that has been mentioned also by David Rosen in his address. We at the Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna wrote a report on Italian religious literacy, and the second report with Francesca Cadeddu on the European religious literacy. That means the fact that in this continent we have abandoned a certain sort of stereotype when people is going into agnostic or atheistic practice from usually a Christian background or another background. And this made possible a common language among them, and also the development of practical juridical solution for this. What we call laïcité in Europe is, to a certain extent, the best way to arrange relations between Christians and former Christians. Not so effective in curbing anti-Semitism in France, in French history, and in France even in recent years, but capable to create a common sense. The complexity of the pluralistic society demands more religious literacy that is not simply teaching neutral or secular knowledge about religions, but also a system that is capable to disseminate knowledge and consciousness of what is religious tradition in its entire diachronical development, as this was mentioned by Taylor Holland properly. So I think that the Department of State report in Europe has something to say that I will resume in a few points. First of all, Europe has something to say about religious freedom. The Europe as a union has very different systems of regulating religious practice. Before Brexit, we had a country in which the prime minister could not change its Christian confession if he wanted, and Tony Blair had to wait for the end of his mandate for becoming Catholic faithful. We had a country like France in which laïcité, it's a sort of religion d'etat based on principle. We have a country like Italy in which a concordatarian system does not prevent the Constitutional Court to say that laïcité is a supreme principle in our system. But what we can detect is this model made of many models, this non-model made of many models, is capable to produce a good degree of freedom for individual and communities. Not at all perfect, not at all invulnerable to intolerance, but a good system. And this is something that may say that there is a path and there is a future for the development of this principle that must be dealt with diplomatic tools, with educational tools, and with research. I'm very happy that in the next few weeks, the European Forum for Research Infrastructure will announce the approval of a European research infrastructure on religious studies, connecting research institutions led by Italy. And this approval from the ESFRI Forum of a CERN, so to say, of religious studies means that we do believe that there is a connection between this experience of a pluralistic way of managing pluralism and the capacity of having and producing knowledge. This is very needed, and this will be at the core also of the G20 forum, because in many circumstances, the people involved in interfaith dialogue are preaching a very standard sermon that is not bad, but it can be a bit ironical, saying that religious people using the religion for violence are abusing their religion. And this remembers to me the famous story of the sermon saying that true lions are vegetarians, non-vegetarian lions are not true lions, and the big lions will eat non-vegetarian lions because he is not at all vegetarian. So what we have to do is to go beyond the simple description of what abuse is, being carefully saying that abuse is abuse of religion. But we have to enter into a different mood and trying to go into a second mile of interfaith dialogue, in which comprehension, understanding, and the cultural development of different communities may increase the quantity of rights in their entirety that the human beings may enjoy. And I think that in this, the support and the analysis of the Department of State that are very careful and very fair as it was planned are an important input for our reflection. It is food for thought for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Melloni. Best wishes for the forum you are going to chair. Let me thank you. Let me thank all of the speakers here in Rome and abroad. Let me thank President Gumina, Amerigo Association, and the Utopia Studios, which hosted this event. Goodbye. Thank you once again.